When beginning a digital transformation, most organizations we work with aren't ready to answer some basic fundamental questions that they need to answer before they start that transformation. But what exactly are those questions, and what are the answers, more importantly? That's what I'm going to talk about here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And when starting on a digital transformation, oftentimes there's a lot of momentum. People are excited about the project. There's an urgency that's been created. There's momentum you want to ride. And it can be easy to prematurely jump into the transformation without answering some basic fundamental questions that are going to provide a strong foundation for your transformation success. So what I want to do today is cover the 10 most important questions that you should be asking yourselves as you get started on the project. And these are questions that you need to have the answers to before you get started. And if for some reason when listening to these top 10 things you find that you don't have a good answer for any one or more of these things, it may be time to take a step back and say, well, let's answer that question before we get started on the transformation. And that's what I'll talk about here today. The first question to answer, which is probably the most basic one in our list here, is why are we changing? Why are we going through this transformation? And oftentimes what happens is organizations think they have a really good answer, like we have to upgrade our technology in order to grow, or our software vendor is decommissioning an old legacy system and they're basically forcing us to move to a new system. But those are really core fundamental reasons for change, but they're not good enough. You need more of a fundamental reason of what it is you expect to get out of this project longer term. So one of the key things you need to ask yourself is why are we going through this change? And it needs to be more comprehensive than something as simple as because we have to or because we have no choice. I always encourage clients to take a step further than that and really define what it is they want to be when they grow up and what they want their future state to be as part of this digital transformation. So one of the best ways to unpack the why we're doing this project is to define the business value that we expect to get out of this transformation. And these should be measurable metrics and things that should affect performance metrics and results of our organization. So it gets back to the point I just made a moment ago about how you need to define the purpose of this project beyond something as simple as we just have to do this project. Now's the time to define what sort of business benefits do we expect? What sort of impact to customer experience do we expect? What do we expect the employee experience to be? How do we expect to affect inventory levels? How do we expect this to affect our supply chain or improve our supply chain? Those are just a few examples of the sorts of questions you could be asking within this broader question of what sort of business value do we expect. Now, once you've answered this question, you should start to quantify the expected business benefits and the business value in the form of a business case, an ROI analysis of what it is we expect to get, not only to justify the investment in whatever transformation you're about to go through, but more importantly, to hold yourselves accountable and to measure what business value we actually get after the fact. You have to remember that most organizations fail to realize the business value that they expect out of their transformations. And one of the main reasons why this is because they don't adequately define what sort of business value they expect, therefore they don't achieve the business value. So it's really important to take the moment to define what it is we expect to get out of this project going forward. The next question you need to ask yourself is what is our future state target operating model going to be? In other words, what are our business processes going to look like? How are we going to be structured? How is data and information and workflows, how is that all going to integrate throughout the entire organization? So when defining what your future target operating model is, it's important to think of that as sort of a what do you want to be when you grow up and how do you want to use technology and potential people and process improvements to enable that future state. And a lot of organizations mistakenly think that they will just defer the answer to that question until they start deploying technology. It goes with this whole concept of the agile movement. People think that they just need to jump in and start deploying stuff. That's one of the worst things you can do because you end up going aimlessly in different directions that may not be aligned with what you want that future state operating model to be. So it's really important to define what that future state is before you start to deploy technologies, because ultimately that future state target operating model should drive the technology rather than assuming that the technology will somehow magically give you the answer of how you want to run your business going forward. It's a great sales message that works really well for the software vendors and the system integrators, but it's not reality. You have to define what that blueprint is, the business blueprint for change, and how technology is going to enable those business processes going forward. Just as we need to define our future state target operating model and business processes, we also need to define our organizational design. How are people's roles and responsibilities going to change? How are people's reporting relationships going to change? Are we going to restructure? What do we expect of our employees? And what does that look like post-transformation? Those are all questions that need to be answered early on in the project, ideally in parallel with and as part of defining your future state target operating model. Typically, you can do that in parallel, but I call this out as a separate question because oftentimes organizations will define the business processes, but then they forget to define how it affects the organization or it affects the people side of change, and you really have to do both. So you want to make sure that you are identifying how the organization is going to change and what that future state organization is going to be going forward, again, before you start deploying technologies. And this is actually an iterative process. You need to start the process of defining the future organizational state early in the transformation. But as you get into the details of the technologies and you start to configure and design and deploy technologies, you'll start to understand in more detail at a more granular level what some of those changes are going to be and what some of the impacts are. But you don't want to wait until you get to that granular level of detail. You want to start that as early as possible in a transformation. Now, once you've defined the purpose of your transformation, the expected business value, the future state operating model, and organizational design, now you can look at what kind of technology is going to best help us realize this future state vision that we've set for ourselves. Oftentimes organizations pick the technology first, then try to figure out how the future state's going to fit within that, and that's a backwards way of doing it. You might end up with the wrong technology at the very least. Even if you have the right technology, you're going to deploy it in a way that's not aligned with that future state. So selecting technology that best fits that future state is critical. You don't want to just simply put in technology that automates things the way you've always done things. You want it to focus on that future state. So choosing the right technology that fits with your future state is something that's very critical and a question that needs to be answered early in your digital strategy. Another question that needs to be answered very early in the planning process is understanding what the project roles are and who's going to fill them. And when I talk about project roles, I'm not just talking about outside implementation consultant or software vendor roles. I'm talking about your roles internally within the organization. Who's going to be the overall program manager that's going to manage the software vendor and the implementation consultants? Who's going to be your change team? What does that change management team look like? Who's going to sign off on business processes? So who are the business process owners? What are the roles and responsibilities of the executive steering committee? What types of decisions do they need to be involved with? A lot of different roles that need to be defined, and if you don't have good answers to these questions, it's going to cost you a lot of time and money later because either A, you're not going to have the right project governance in place to manage the project effectively and to budget, and or B, you're going to deploy technology without the involvement of key people internally, and it's going to get off track because you're not managing the project the way it should be. One way to look at this is thinking of yourselves and your internal team as sort of a general contractor. You're the one that's going to bring in the outside resources and the internal resources that are going to support the project, but ultimately it's you that's responsible for the overall success. If one of those roles isn't being adequately filled, you can either try to change or coach the people to perform better, or you can swap out and bring in resources that are going to better enable that future vision of what you're trying to achieve. But regardless, you want to make sure that you have those roles clearly defined and you understand what the overall project governance is for the implementation project team itself. Another question to ask yourself is, what is our digital strategy and what is our plan? A lot of times organizations think, well, that's what the software vendor is going to tell us, or that's what the system integrator or implementation partner is going to tell us. No, the reality is you need to define what that strategy and plan is and then bring in the system integrators and the vendors and the consultants to help you execute that. Now, you can certainly take input from consultants and software vendors, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't use outside resources because you will need them, but ultimately it should be your team and your decision of what that overall strategy and plan is. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One is that software vendors and system integrators tend to look at their project plans and strategies myopically from a technology perspective, but you as an organization need to look at it from a more comprehensive business perspective that includes non-technological things like change management, process improvements, architecture, data migration, all those sorts of things that are going to be critical to a project, but they're not part of the software vendor or system integrator plans. So when we talk about making sure you have a clear project strategy and plan, it's important to not just defer to a software vendor's plan, because that will be part of your overall plan, but you're probably going to have to sanitize that plan and make it fit and accommodate your culture and what you're trying to accomplish. And you're also going to have to augment that with things that your software vendor or system integrator doesn't do. So your overall program plan is a good way to think about this, as something you need to define early in the project. Now, just to build on a point I made in the previous point, it's important to recognize that your system integrator is typically not going to be the silver bullet, the complete answer to what you need to make your transformation successful. Not only do you need your internal resources, as we discussed earlier, but you also need to make sure you bring in the outside support to do the things that your system integrator doesn't do or doesn't do well. So this would include things like organizational change management, comprehensive organizational change strategies and change tactics that work from a business transformation perspective is needed to augment the more core technology training type of change management that a software vendor or system integrator might do. Another example is business process improvement. That oftentimes is its own work stream within the project plan that should be managed by someone other than the system integrator. The system integrator or vendor might be providing you the technology to enable process improvements, but ultimately it's up to you to roll those process changes out to the organization. A couple other examples would be overall system architecture. How are the systems going to tie together? You might have a core ERP system, for example, that needs to connect to a customer relationship management or a sales automation system, or a human capital or HR system, or a warehouse management or supply chain management system. Whatever it is, you're going to probably need some sort of integration between systems, and you need to define that solution architecture. And then finally, another example is data migration. Typically, clients are responsible for cleansing, mapping, and migrating data from their legacy systems to the new systems. The software vendors and system integrators might provide the tool set and the framework to do so, but ultimately it's up to you to do that. So typically, one of the areas we help clients with is helping them with that data migration strategy. So these are just some of the things to think about as you think about what the overall plan and strategy is. Make sure it's aligned with who you are as an organization and what your goals and objectives for the project are. And make sure you augment the system integrator with all the activities that need to support the overall transformation. Really important question that you need to ask before you really start the transformation is the question of, are we aligned as a team internally? Are we aligned in terms of what we expect to get out of this project? Are we aligned around expectations in terms of the transformation plan and the strategy itself? Are we aligned around the project governance and the decision making? Are we aligned around what we want to be when we grow up? All those things we need alignment on. And if you're not aligned, it's really important to take a step back, slow things down, maybe hit the timeout button on the overall transformation and answer those questions. Try to get aligned. And this is an area where we help clients oftentimes to facilitate alignment in terms of getting a clear vision and articulating that vision and making sure that the stakeholders are aligned and moving in the same direction, so that when we start the transformation, we're rowing in the same direction and we're not dealing with the headwinds of misalignment. And those headwinds of misalignment will slow down your project and cause it to cost a lot more than you can possibly imagine. In fact, that internal misalignment is one of the biggest risks that organizations face. So it's really important that you overcome this misalignment issue and make sure you're aligned to start. And you might get misaligned again, or you might get off track throughout the implementation or the transformation. But at the very least, you want to have that alignment as you start the project. The last question you need to ask yourself before you start your transformation is, how are we going to hold ourselves accountable for the success of this project? Who is going to be accountable for this? You ultimately need an executive sponsor that is the ultimate point of authority and decision making on a project. But in addition to that, no one person can be the single point of accountability. That's not enough. You need other people to support that as well. You need to define who's going to be responsible for certain business benefits that you expect to get out of the system. Who's accountable for making sure that the project stays on track on budget? Who's responsible for making sure that we get the right resources internally on the project? And if they have conflicts with priorities, who's responsible for making sure we get those priorities clarified? Those are just some examples of accountability that's very important. Not only during the transformation, but also post-transformation. We need to make sure that people are accountable for making sure that this transformation doesn't just get delivered on time and on budget, but more importantly, delivers the business value we expect, and it doesn't disrupt our business operations in a way that will negatively affect our operations and financial results. So it's really important to think about this from a benefits realization perspective and an accountability perspective going forward. So these are just some of the things you should be asking yourselves. And again, if you don't have good answers to any one or more of these questions, I highly encourage you to pause your transformation, resist the temptation to just bring in the system integrator or the software vendor to come help figure this out for you, because ultimately these are decisions that only you can make, and these are questions that only you can answer. You can certainly ask for inputs and advice from others, but ultimately it will be up to you to make those decisions in a way that makes the most sense for you as an organization. Now, for more information that I think will help unpack this a bit more and help you understand some of the things to think about as you get started on your transformation, I encourage you to download our annual digital transformation report. It's a very exhaustive report that talks about best practices and lessons from transformations over the last decades that we've been doing this. And it also provides a number of independent technology rankings and reviews that might help you choose the right technology for your organization. So you can download that by using the link that I've included in the description below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.